This presentation is exploring the use of a community of practice model to improve blended and flipped approaches to teaching and learning in the Faculty of the Health Sciences. So please welcome Georgia and Leah.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming to listen to us talk about a project that we undertook last year within the Faculty of Health Sciences. So myself and Leah were lucky enough to be part of this community of practice that that worked together to trial a whole range of strategies around flipped and blended learning. We worked with, how many disciplines are there? 14 within health, so a very diverse faculty, a group of participants that had a very diverse range of past experience and skills. And so it proved to be challenging, but we got some favourable results ultimately, we think. And the data that we acquired in our evaluation of the project kind of reflects that. So I'm going to talk about basically what we did, and Leah, who was kind of the brains behind the evaluation process that we used, is going to talk about that because that's her baby. So as I said, in terms of overview, we wanted to trial this idea of a community of practice. So a group that works together to pilot a whole range of strategies. This initiative fitted nicely with the LTC framework, which was aiming to advance flexible learning. So within our faculty, there's 6 schools and 13 disciplines within those schools. And the project was funded by the Office of the ADLT with some funds for buyout for staff, for teaching buyout to enable travel into meetings, all that sort of thing, and some specialised resources as required. So the people involved, myself, as the academic lead, my role was to basically collate some reference materials, do a bit of research to support the implementation, and to facilitate the community of practice, to make sure meetings happen and to encourage attendance at those and all of that sort of stuff. Also to do a bit of support work for the teaching teams involved in the development of units, and to figure out, luckily I had Leah on hand, to figure out how to evaluate the process and its effectiveness, and contribute, as we are now, to scholarship in the area, and hopefully we'll push forward and get some publications out of it. We had involved in the project also Maria Bora, who was the educational designer with the faculty at the time, and she gave us kind of specialist advice on some pedagogical stuff and some educational design. And also involved, we had 15 national team leaders or lecturers in charge of various units to play with their content. The goals, overarching goal was to explore whether this idea of community of practice was a good vehicle to implement sound practices and, importantly, sustainable approaches to flipped and blended learning within the faculty. So we wanted to build a community that would grow across the Faculty of Health Science, which is a very complex faculty, that we were aiming to just introduce incremental improvements and not overwhelm people. And I think the keynote speech this morning, when Gregor was talking about that quadrant 3, where there's a lot of that interactive learning going on, people are kind of a bit scared of that area. We wanted people to be comfortable with the idea that they didn't have to take on the world, and that small gain was advantageous, and that it was a process of incremental improvement. We wanted to sort of catalogue for the faculty some exemplars of good practice, which we have managed to do successfully, and I've spoken about the sustainability, that's fairly obvious. I'm a paramedic, and this looks well out of place here. It's kind of paramedicine 101. So this is just a bit of an analogy that has kind of embodies what we did. The top image there is what paramedicine 101, what we call the chain of survival. And what it sort of symbolises is in order for somebody to come out alive after a cardiac arrest, we have to have a sequence of things in place fairly rapidly. The first one is early recognition, so somebody who says, hey, they're dead, and calls an ambulance or calls help. Early CPR, okay, so basically all CPR does is keep blood moving around your body until we can fix up the underlying problem. Early defibrillation, which is somebody coming along zapping you, and early advanced life support, which is just basically putting drugs in you and hoping that they work and you come alive. That seems irrelevant in this context. However, it kind of it explains the blended learning process, I think, in some ways. But how we used to teach CPR, did anybody do CPR 20 years ago, CPR training? Okay, so how we used to teach it was really kind of convoluted. You had to do a certain ratio of compressions to breaths, and what happened was, people were a bit overwhelmed, particularly in the context of kind of the emotional situation of it. People were a bit overwhelmed and scared by it. And reluctant to do it. And so in terms of the outcomes, that process had a really negative impact on the outcomes because people didn't want to do it. And so we had this part of the chain, the early CPR bit, kind of missing. So we've changed our approach completely to teaching CPR to one that is push on somebody's chest, go hard and fast and call an ambulance, basically. And what we're finding is we get better outcomes. So we kind of applied that approach to the blended learning thing. We didn't want to get too bogged down in the meaning, because what was happening was people were going, what is blended learning? And there's a bazillion definitions out there, and we could have spent another 4 years exploring the literature on flipped blended learning and debating it. So we kind of decided, let's jump in there, let's trial some stuff and support each other and overcome that kind of fear barrier and look at the outcomes. Luckily, the literature supported that premise, and so if you have a look at the first quote up there, it says, ultimately the exact definition of blended learning beyond some combination of online and face-to-face may not matter. So that kind of supports that understanding of, if as long as the basics are there, as long as it's a mix of online and face-to-face, we're not going to get bogged down in the precise, such and such compressions and such ventilations type approach. So digging deeper into that a little bit, we incorporated online components, and blended learning is a mix of online and traditional social models, and I think that's the critical thing, is it's maximising that social experience where students are interfaced with each other and using the things that can be outsourced to the online environment, which is primarily the content delivery stuff, but just maximising the social experience. That there's multi-directional interaction, and again going back to the keynote this morning, where the interactions between the teacher to student, student to student, and student to content, that multi-directional activity. That there's some self-paced activities that cater for different styles and abilities, and just listening to the bioscience people who've produced a couple of packages, a chemistry and a biology package there, that kind of reinforce that understanding, and that there's an integration of student-centred learning, and there's class-based and mobile teaching and all of that sort of stuff. What was also significant in the literature was that there is a continuous effort required over several years. So, we weren't going to change the world in 12 months or the ultimately 9 months that we had for the project, but we did want to build a foundation. So we wanted to build that foundation using this idea of a community of practice, which I also call a group, because I like to keep things simple. But it's a group with a difference, and I think it's a kind of a widely used concept these days. But it's a group that operates within a specific domain, so a specific field of understanding, that there is a community, so people involved, and that it's applied to practice. So we kind of fitted within that framework. And the interesting part also of this model of community of practice is that this idea of legitimate peripheral participation, which I think we will talk about in the outcomes part, because there's commonly activity around the edges beyond the group, where a lot of work's getting done and we're influencing change, but that's difficult to kind of measure, and that was noted when we were doing this project. This is also an effective model for communicating across silos, and certainly within health there's lots of silos, lots of disciplines, and there was a lot of collaboration between the disciplines. And as a means of fostering innovation. So that was thought to be an appropriate vehicle to facilitate the changes we were aiming for. So we looked at this project in 3 stages. We had an initial meeting, which was a face-to-face thing, get to know each other, do a bit of planning, talk about what the barriers were that we needed to overcome collectively, and all the usual type of stuff came out, haven't got time, all of that, to agree to a way forward in terms of how we would communicate with each other and support one another, and agree to an endpoint, which it turned out to be a showcase of what each individual within the group had been doing, and an evaluation. So that initial meeting discussed the barriers. The barriers were things like, the workload, the workload model, the spatial things, how am I going to communicate with somebody in Sydney when I work in Melbourne, all of that sort of stuff. We used Maria Bora, who was the educational designer, to talk about the conceptual stuff, to talk about the meanings of flipped and blended learning, all of that sort of stuff. We set individual and group targets, and identified any additional support we required, and discussed how we'd evaluate the project. So the ongoing challenges were time and technology, predictably, the temporal spatial stuff, organisational and structural barriers, and the diversity that we had in terms of our understandings, how much experience we had, all of that sort of stuff, as well as the knowledge differences in terms of how we understood knowledge and what our background was. So the science people wanted all this really rigorous structure, and me being a paramedic thought that'll do. And, there was a whole range of difference there, which actually turned out to be good, because we actually, as a community, we leveraged off that diversity, and that turned out to be favourable for us. And in terms of our ongoing communication strategies, the asynchronous stuff, we set up a Leo site to communicate, and that was not that well subscribed to. It was challenging to meet across 14 people with different timetables on different campuses by phone meetings, all of that sort of stuff. So the communication kind of evolved to like an organic thing, more localised, people collaborating on the campuses that they happen to share, and that sort of stuff. So we weren't quite sure whether it fitted with the notion of community of practice. In terms of evaluation, we chose 3 strategies at those couple of first meetings. The academic group chose to evaluate their success by means of two strategies: goal attainment scaling, which Leah's going to talk about, and a focus group at the end of the project. And we also wanted to put it to the students, so we designed typical thing, a 14-question Likert scale survey to put to the students, and nobody ended up using that. But I think what we did evaluate, which is the most important part, is this community of practice and its effectiveness. Leah, is that 20 minutes away?
That's 5 to go, right? So you probably heard from Georgia the way that she's been explaining this community of practice is that it's quite an eclectic thing. So when you measure something like an intervention, what we'd like to see is that there's one thing that's going to affect change, and we'll be able to track that back. What we recognised very quickly from this project was that there's lots of bits to the community of practice that could be making an effect on what people do and influencing the changes that they're making in their units. And so we felt we needed a way of evaluating individual changes that people were making that recognised their own personal goals and what they wanted to achieve within this journey. So goal attainment scaling presented itself as a viable option, and it is an individualised, criterion referenced measure of change, which means you can tailor it to the needs of the individual. It's very commonly used in mental health, which was actually where it originated as a method, and it's used a lot in allied health as well to measure changes because it recognises heterogeneous populations and the fact that everybody's different. So what it allowed us to do was set goals for ourselves as individuals, but you can also aggregate the data. So for those who sort of like numbers and trends and things, that actually is a really helpful thing as well. I'm a qualitative researcher, so the fact that I'm going to talk about T-scores is a really big thing for me. So. I'm not sure how clearly you can see that, but this is just to give a little example of what GAS looks like. So it really involves a SMART goal to start out with. So all of the lecturers were put in the position of what we ask our students to do: create a SMART goal for your client, only in this case it's for ourselves. And then from that point, we identified where we were currently up to with the skill that we wanted to improve. That was our baseline. And then we actually constructed levels of achievement around that goal. So in GAS, the level that we're aiming for is 0, which is highlighted in the middle there. So everybody wrote their expected level of achievement for each goal as their 0 value. And then the levels above that are greater than expected achievement and much greater than expected achievement. And the two levels below are obviously less than and much less than. So what this immediately presents to us is that 0 is going to be the same for everybody because it's the expected level, even though the qualitative criteria within that 0 level are different. So each person identified 3 goals, and we were able to utilise the community to say, well, what's your goal? How'd you word that? And this is just an example here. For example, this is one of mine. So the baseline was that I already had some flipped classrooms happening in a particular unit, but I knew that because we'd only run it once, there were pedagogical enhancements that were needed. So I created my goal around nominating a number that I thought was feasible to do well in the time period that we had, for example. So you can see there the range of data. 11 out of our 14 participants ended up submitting their goals for analysis. So in total we had 33 goals that people were working on. And often they complemented each other. So a goal around using technology better, a goal around design generally, and perhaps a goal around increasing interactivity or active learning or participation in face-to-face classes was quite common. So I don't know whether you can see there, but a quick glance with the green shows that the majority of people made progress towards their goals. In fact, they reached or exceeded the 0 level of measurement for their goal. There were only a couple of people who overall didn't feel that the progress was as much as they liked, but on each individual goal, everybody progressed up the scale. Okay, so just another way of showing that is that majority of people were within 1 standard deviation of that mean, so that 0 level, and in fact you can see the majority of the dots were actually achieving above what they were expecting to get to by the end of that period of time. So if we summarise this, without being able to name exactly what factor it was that led to that change, participation in this community of practice and the sheer fact of doing this activity yielded change for people, made them do something different, and it was effective change according to the goals that they put forward. What it also did was that it helped us to become clearer about what our goals were. So articulating them and sharing them with others. And actually the literature suggests that if you do develop your own goals and work towards them, you're much more likely to achieve them than if they're set for you as criteria. In terms of the focus group, very, very broadly, there was lots of positive things that came out. There were a range of views, and therefore that made it interesting in terms of hearing what people were expecting as outcomes of the project. So that theme around the purpose and the value of the community. In terms of the organisational barriers, you've heard Georgia talk about those. Time and connection were the main ones there. There was huge variation in motivation to participate, but in actual fact that legitimised some of that peripheral engagement as well, and possibly what we weren't seeing is all the work that people were doing influencing others outside of the group. And I think really the summarising statement is that people felt it was a starting point, not an ending point. So in terms of the sustainability, the relationship fostering has led to a commitment to keep this thing going, whatever it is, and actually expand it and look at other groups and other connections that could be possible. So to finally evaluate and conclude, change will be slow, and I absolutely agree when Georgia says that small change can be really effective, and they've got to be changes that will stick and that we believe are good pedagogical design. And I think that's what this group fostered, and by seeing the showcase at the end of it, we certainly had a broadening of perspectives of what is possible. I think it is important to cater to individual goals because that is your intrinsic motivation. So people need to feel like they're working towards a skill or an area that's important to them, as well as an overarching university strategy as well. So lots of acknowledgements to all of the individuals who are involved in the project, and thank you again to Georgia for leading this particular initiative, and also to the support of the faculty. So we're flipping it now, and it's over to you. So any questions, but also any particular experiences or strategies that you feel have been helpful that would continue that community discussion going. Thank you very much. Yes, yes.
Thanks, guys. That was really interesting. On the goal setting.
Oh, I knew it.
No, not stats. Don't worry.
Go.
Could you use that same concept in a classroom with the students, and they could maybe have goal settings at the beginning of their first year, second year, and third year, and you could see if the units that they're involved in were actually assisting that process? Would that be something that's doable?
Yeah. I actually think, I think that's a lovely idea. In health sciences, we teach our students, certainly in speech pathology, to write goal attainment scales for the clients that they will be working with, and we encourage them to do that collaboratively. But to at first experience that process of setting your own goal and then identifying what the steps are towards your achievement of that goal, I think is an excellent idea. Absolutely.
That could be like a workshop, the ADLT could
Yep.
put something together, because
Yep.
I think a lot of academics would, that was really good, thank you.
Pleasure, thank you. Actually, it lends itself to a flipped classroom kind of idea insofar as they can go away and learn how to do it, bring it into a tutorial and have a really interactive experience with their peers around, what people are working on, yeah.
Are there any more questions?
Can we ask you guys a question? Do you feel that that's a helpful kind of thing that you could set up within your local communities, faculties, without the formal structure? Because, we sort of thought it worked within our group, but it's interesting to know whether a similar concept would be effective within other organisational units. Just nodding heads.
I think potentially it could be those people that you've highlighted, those 15 academics, and getting them to maybe address those, say, in exercise science. They had Michael and Liz Bradshaw,
Liz,
for
yeah.
example.
Yep.
maybe for them to have a working group to have a discussion on that specifically if they think that would work, maybe one
Yep.
from each state, and then again if that's something, then they could extend that beyond that group, if that makes sense. I don't
And
know.
that was kind of the idea, was, you know, that this, I mentioned that the concept of legitimate peripheral participation, which is kind of the stuff that goes on around the edges. And there were a few disciplines where it was really evident that was happening, like midwifery was one of them. You know, there was a lot of activity within midwifery in flipped and blended stuff that was noticeable, probably because I sat near them, so I saw what was going on. But, you know, it'd be interesting to see what was going on in other areas just because you're sitting near them, you know, and that's where a lot of the work goes on. It's hard to measure. I don't know how you do it. So there's another question for you. How do you measure it?
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks.